Hey class, so this is it. This is the second to last lecture. It's basically over. This is it. We went through a whole semester. Honestly, it's kind of amazing to think about because this semester has been really difficult in many ways, and I'm sure if it's been difficult for me, it's no doubt been extremely difficult for you. And I hope I've given you the room to do as best as you can, but my overall goal was to have you learn at least one thing from this class and apply that to your life. Personally, I think education should be useful. There was once an article that came out a couple years ago out of Emerson that my mentor Paul Miletis and Eric Gordon wrote, and it was, how is this information useful? And it was about how do we make what we've learned into something we do, into something we enact in our daily lives. If and when you decide to go to grad school, and that's a choice you make, you may have to take a test called the GRE. And the GRE is a game, just like the SATs are. And what they often say is to learn how to play that game better, because they're well aware of the game, because ETS is kind of a scam, it really is. It's kind of like a weird for-profit entry point. The way to make it work, just like learning a language, is use new vocabulary in your everyday life. And by doing so, you start to increase your vocabulary because you're replacing smaller words with bigger words and using them in context. The same goes for much of the information that we do in this class and hopefully things you do in your other class. If you chose in a future, in a certain degree, the things you learn are so you can become fluent in them. So they become part of your everyday life and your everyday way of being. So with social media, the reason why I think it's important, and obviously I'm biased towards this, is because we can't avoid it. We're always in social media. Social media is all around us. There's really, as we know, no outside to social media. That means wherever you are, as we've talked about, you're on social media. Whether you're in the store or on the internet or on your phone, you're on social media. And a lot of these things are all interconnected. And so the more we make this knowledge part of our everyday lives, the more likely it is that we'll be able to negotiate our agency into the next decade. Agency is the word of being your own agent, somebody who has the free will, the ability to act on certain ways that aren't performative for one thing, or if they're performative, you've made the choice to be performative, but they are not being chosen for you by some sort of structure. And so that's, I think, is really important. So as we get to the end of this, I just want to go over a few more things and go over what the final is, because really this is the lecture in which I'm going to tell you how to do your final, which I think you'll enjoy a bit. So first is, if you've updated your iOS to 14.5 recently, some of you may have seen a warning on Facebook or Instagram where it tells you how to keep Facebook free. And the way that Facebook is free, is what they say, is it allows data tracking. It allows you to be traced wherever you are. In 14.5's new thing, it really is about how the App Store operates. Apple's App Store now has a way of making data more transparent. Where does your data go? And I think that's really important. But you could see from the warning that Facebook puts out that it's a really big threat to their business model, because while they tell people that their business model is advertising, the real secret to their business model is human data, is the ability to turn you into a quantized self, into something that is no longer full of agency, but actually something that's just numerical to be traded and sold millions of times per day. And that type of business model wasn't really expected or scalable onto this point, but the problem is that a lot of these platforms, not just Facebook, have basically changed their business model to be reliant solely on data quantization and human quantization and the buying and selling of your data many times a day. That reliance has caused them to be stuck in a corner, so to speak. They can't really get out of that choice, and now they're relying on you to basically say, yeah, you can keep having my data so that you don't have to make it free. You don't have to charge for your site. But you should always remember, social media is never free and never has been free. It always costs something. We talked about this with Shoshana Zuboff, that she once said that, we used to say that it's about, if you don't pay for it, you're the product. And she goes one step farther, which is you don't only not pay for it and you're the product, but you're actually, willingness is part of a future unchosen by you, but of the social media corporations. So productization is just a given. In other words, when you're using social media, everything beyond that is actually what social media does. But as we've seen over the last decade, so much has changed. The decade really begins, as I've said, probably around the time, the last decade begins right around that time of the Miracle on the Hudson. But really the big event that changed the world was the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was a moment where small uprisings in Tunisia really became more prolific when French students in Tunisia started sharing the information on Facebook. The Arab Spring then resulted in 4 different countries going to full-on civil war, and that was Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. Syria is still in the civil war. Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia all toppled their governments. Their presidents, which I almost said dictator is important, because their presidents were in over 30-year terms at that point. And that means it's not really a presidential thing. If your president's been president for over 30 years, it's probably not clear anymore. But where are they now? These countries don't really have stable governments, and Syria is still in a civil war. And that's because social media may offer us the tools sometimes to make these massive changes, but they don't offer us the follow-through, because that is not social media's goal. The goal of Mark Zuckerberg isn't for you to solve the world's crises, but to keep a crisis happening indefinitely. Because the more data you are talking about, communication that you could spread about something, the more it's worth value. So we don't really think about the fact that we try to create revolution online, but unless you have a way of creating the completion to that revolution, there's not really a revolution, maybe a reformation. And reformations are just as good, but they live alongside. A reformation usually lives alongside the formal structure. So oftentimes you ask an existential question about social media that's been asked in this class many times. Is social media a force of social good, or is it just massive and disgusting surveillance? And those are things that we don't have an answer to at this point, and perhaps we will in the future when the next version of whatever this is comes about. Remember, it was only 1989, the same year that America's Funniest Videos appeared, that the World Wide Web was launched. And from that point forward, we've had the WWW. In the early 90s, in 1993, the first browser was made, so the way to access it. By the following year, there was about 10 million websites. By the following 100 million, now innumerable. And somehow now 4, which I always say is like basically what we have. We have 4 websites that share the material of other websites. But this has caused obviously problems. This consolidation of websites into 4 main outlets of communication, social media, has caused us to have these little tiny pockets of information, and conspiracy theories and hoaxes have become most prevalent out of everything. And this causes us a problem, because how do we know how things operate? What structure of reality are we living in, and whose reality are we competing with? Social media doesn't have an answer for those realities. It doesn't have a corrective measure, as we read in Brandy Zadrozny's piece. That it doesn't have an ability to do it except for human content moderators. And as Luke Bailey actually says on a recent podcast, for every 1,000 users, you should really have 1 content moderator. And that's just not feasibly possible on an internet site. So what are we left with but self-governance of our own information? And obviously we've seen that that doesn't work out, because from our previous assignments and previous lectures, you've seen that misinformation just becomes reality and then becomes outrage bait across tons of different sites. And then we're arguing about something that simply doesn't exist at all. But what we need is context. What the most important thing I think you need to take away from this class is understanding that context is more important than anything else. How do you contextualize information? How do you put it into the larger space? And context doesn't just happen just by comparing it to other things, but it requires time. It requires time to pass, and enough time to pass that we could look back on something and see its corrective. I'm going to give you an example. Very early on in the 2010s and 2010s, I was at that point founding a new media major. I was founding an internet studies degree. And at the time I was building a book, which eventually became Producing New and Digital Media, the book that I put out, which was revised recently. And one of the things that I was pushing for explaining in that text was media literacy with an asterisk, things that we have to look out for in the future, things that aren't yet figured out, but we have to make sure that we have an open mind towards a corrective. One of my earliest examples that I put in there was when Auto-Tune the News used to do these very somewhat problematic videos of auto-tuning things. And some that you might remember were the Bed Intruder song, or Sweet Brown's her apartment was burning. And in those I was like, well, those are wildly viral videos. Bed Intruder's song actually became, when lifted off of the video, became part of a Billboard hit. It was one of the earliest viral songs to end up being part of the Billboard 100. And I used to say that that's a video with an asterisk, because what we're really looking at in some ways is poverty porn. We're making fun of somebody for their inability to have any real protection. The song is extremely sad. It's about a home invasion. And we laugh at it or we make fun of it, but what we're really doing is optimizing content for shareability without the regard to the human itself. And that means that we need context and time to look back and say, you know what, maybe that wasn't right to laugh at. But why didn't we know at the time that that was not right to laugh at? And that's because time tries to figure those types of things out. And I think that's an important part of what it means to really become part of social media. A second example actually happened very recently. A former student of mine at Malloy actually messaged me and said, whenever I'm researching, I think of you. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really nice. But then I realized, no, it's not because I inspire someone to do research, which would have been quite endearing, but rather it was because my photo, a PR photo of me teaching, is on the research page when they go to the JSTOR. There's a picture of me teaching. In that photo, after I said, well, that's, I get the joke now, but after I looked at that photo, I realized I was teaching a class about a man named Weave, a man named Andrew Auernheimer. I'm not going to even say his name right, and I don't want you to go any further than just me looking it up. And I said, this image is quite problematic. The picture was taken in 2013, and it was an article by Matthias Schwartz in the New York Times in 2008 about the web trolls, people who were trolling each other online in 2008. And I was trying to explain to people in 2013 that the 2010s is going to give us problems. Radicalization is going to be one of the biggest factors and issues we're going to see over the next decade. Weave is currently in hiding. He is one of the biggest neo-Nazis out there. He was arrested for hacking at one point. And it is very, very unfortunate that that picture is actually still on the research page. Well, I hope that maybe people recognize every so often and say, you know what, that's not an appropriate picture. But you know what, I don't work at that school anymore, so not too worried about it. But that being said, reflective action and looking back tells us that maybe PR photos themselves contain extra data that we might not be thinking about. So me being a digital ghost on my former institution's website leaves me some questions about how the future. So I think one thing though I also want you to take away from this class is that social media kind of eschews collective action. It believes in rugged individualism, which is kind of what the United States is based on in general. Rugged individualism is the ability that we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We can do it. We can make things change. But it's not really true. Being by yourself doesn't really make that much. You need people together to do it. Social media requires isolation. One person, one machine. One person, one phone. One person, and many to many. It's uniquely many. But if there were a collective, it probably wouldn't profit model the same way because we'd be sharing in some way. But really, a lot of those ways to combat fake news is to actually be in a collective, is to share information across other people and to try to keep an open mind towards the way that it kind of works, to dig deeper. One of the things that actually I want to kind of go to where I'll lead into where we're going next with this is just to wrap up some of the things that we've looked at in the previous homework assignments. Courtney said something that caught my eye, that while we were talking about the fake news, the Brandy Zadrozny piece about that small town in Pennsylvania. And Courtney wrote that when she looks at information, she decides on what she wants to choose to give her energy to. And I thought that was really important because I think, and I can't prove this, but I think your bullshit detectors are really good. I think kind of in a little bit in the back of your mind when something's real or not. You have a real sense of whether or not the veracity of something is supposed to be something you take with you and memorize, or is something that you have to analyze further. And I think that giving the energy is actually a really good bite. It reminds me of Mike Caulfield. He's one of my favorite academics. He has a method of media literacy that I buy into more than anything. Like I've said many times, media literacy is my background, digital media literacies, digital competencies. I love knowing that people know how to use new media. That's my favorite thing in the entire world. It inspires me further if I know that people learn that way. Like that makes me very, very happy. Mike Caulfield's method is called SIFT, S-I-F-T. Here's the 4 steps of SIFT. Stop. That's the first one. So when you see something that's interesting or weird, you stop. You have to realize that there's something weird about it. Second, interrogate the source, it's the I. Find out right away, really quick. This is supposed to be quick. SIFT is a very quick method. Right away, figure out the source, the place in which it's coming from holds veracity in the first place. If the URL or the author or something like that is easily from a Macedonian news factory that has no real outlet and it's just sort of out there, it's not really going to be real. Many of you during that assignment actually said, well, if it's coming from the Daily Mail or E-News, it's not exactly going to be the thing that you go and say, oh, that's true. It's usually sensationalized. And that's exactly what happened with that meat thing and the University of Michigan study, is that came from the Daily Mail. So it was literally fake news to begin with, but it was packaged in a way that was shareable. So interrogate the source. Try to figure out what that's good. 3, F, find better coverage. So the thing you should do next is try to find out if there's somebody else covering it. First thing you do, if you find out something that just doesn't feel right, look somewhere else. If it feels like somebody else might have that information, then that might be the place where you want to take a look. And 4, trace the claims, the quotes, and the media to the original content. If you've made it to the T of SIFT, try to trace the origins of the material. If you can get there, if you haven't already realized your bullshit detector is saying this isn't real, if you trace the origins of the material, you will have the veracity. What I often think is that we should always check other places. Many of you actually said this, and I do this. I go to Twitter. I go to see what the discourse is. I search it on Twitter. And when I see that, I try to see who's talking about it and in which way. I get an overall sense of the context of that information from a site of many, many people. Twitter isn't real life, but it does give me many different points of view all at once. So here we are at the end, and now you have one assignment left, and it's your final. Okay, so the final is going to be submit in 2 ways. One, as an assignment, because I have to grade it, because that's how we grade the final. And 2, the same thing, you don't have to submit anything different, the exact same thing in the discussion board so your classmates can see it. And that's it. That's how it goes. Now what you have to do is help me understand what you sense or what you believe is going to be happening in the next decade. The first part, so it's a 2-part final. It's really short, under 2 minutes in any way you can, okay? You can make this a video, you can make this a PowerPoint, you can make this a recording, you can make this a podcast, you can make this anything, literally anything. If it goes over the time, like if you're doing a podcast and it's like an hour, make sure you put the time mark where you're going to talk about this. Or if you're submitting an entire podcast, obviously let us know, because those are consuming. But you could do anything you'd like to do. So if you want to do a long-term video or you want to write a paper, that's fine too. Just make sure you link to the paper. So use Google Docs or a Dropbox where you get to it. You could be creative. You could do a cartoon, whatever. What I'm looking for is a 2-part. 1, what in this class was the most impactful thing? What did you learn that you were just like, well, holy shit, that changed my life. That's going to make me think differently. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe you're like, well, actually, I knew all of this because I'm pretty internet fluent. But that's the first part. Just a brief intro. Well, I learned this and this changed how I saw this, you know? The second part is your intuition. What do you feel the next decade is going to tell us about social media? What's going to be different? This is a broad question. When I'm asked this question, I answer it pretty similar to the way Neal Stephenson does it in his book Fall. Recent book Fall, it's like this thick. It's not a short book. I think it's like 1,200 pages. He somehow puts out a 1,200 page book every 2 years. I don't know. Fall is a sequel to the book Ream D. And Fall is about the future of our internet. And he basically says that over the next decade, we move into the editorial web. The editorial web is when the wide world web or social media basically breaks apart. And we get curators or we get editors. So we basically subscribe. This book came out 2 years ago. We subscribe to different channels basically, and someone out there is an editor, and they're feeding us little bits of this information. So we get our own social media, every single person. I know in fiction world, it's basically an analog to an algorithm, because algorithms already do that for you. But Neal Stephenson pictured, and I picture the same, is that we would subscribe to different internets. 2 years on, here we are, and now we're in newsletter world. Everybody's got a newsletter, everyone subscribes. This class is on a newsletter. So newsletter is technically the editorial web. You choose what you want to gain access to. That's my thought of what the next decade will be like. I do not think that's a good thing, but that is what I think is going to be coming up. What I want you to do is kind of give me a premonition. What do you think is going to happen next? What do you think is the next decade? What does it look like from your point of view? Just a small analysis or based on what you know now from this class and your life, tell me what you think is what's on the horizon. And the reason I want this in a discussion is I've done this before in other classes. I've done this in my final in Intro to New Media, a very similar course at Malloy, and Intro to Digital Media, which is at Hofstra. it's like almost like I'm franchising this to different colleges, is that I make these into time capsules. I take this and I basically say, let's take a look. Let's see what happens. And I haven't even opened the older ones because I didn't start this until 2013, so I haven't reached the decade yet. But when we reach the decade, I start opening them up and I say, hey, maybe this is what we were right. Did we have a premonition of what was coming next? The only way to know is time and context. And perhaps you, by your use of all of social media and your varied experiences, might actually be onto the next big thing. And in that, it doesn't make you the next big CEO. Well, maybe it does. But what it does do is it makes you really, really aware of how to keep your agency as we go into an unknown future. And that is what I want you to do more than anything else, is make sure that you are in charge of you and you know that your collective friends around you are going to be with you and you know how to make choices with a group. Zoom school doesn't help us with that. Here we are again, separated one-to-one, many-to-many, but we're all not together. This pandemic isn't forever. We're nearing its end. Hopefully things return to a version of another world that looks similar to the old one, but hopefully adapts to a new one, and we start becoming more conscious of bigger things like climate change. And we do this collectively, and we start thinking about how we could do things together to start considering how we kind of prevail as a people and protect the place in which we live over the next decade. But we have to do that together. So thank you for your time in this class. There's one more lecture after this, which is just basically the summary. And I really look forward to these projects. They're due May 13th, and I'll make sure the assignment is online. Thanks for your time. And until next time, literally one more next time, and then forever, stay healthy, stay vigilant, stay curious.